Our next speaker is Jeff Wilson, and he's the director and co-founder of the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association. Now, Jeff Wilson.
I want to thank the organizers, particularly Dolores, and the rest of the staff. Why don't everybody give them a round of applause? They've done a fantastic job.
Oh. I forgot to say, they wanted me to thank the staff of the conference and the Magpie production, the AV, for getting rid of that buzz.
But I really appreciate the invitation. I was here 2 years ago, and I had a fantastic time, and I'm really glad to be back. The information I presented last time, I'm not going to really talk about it at all. I'll show it 2 slides to quickly cover what I spent 2 hours talking about last time. This is all brand new information for the most part. This is a crop circle that happened in Ohio, southern Ohio, back at the end of September. And so this is all brand new stuff. And for those that listen to Linda Howe's Earth Files or listen to her radio commentary on Whitley Strieber's show, she did interview me about this, so some people may have seen some of this information, but we'll kind of get through it and talk through it carefully. And I do want to thank Linda Howe personally for recommended me again to come back here. She's a very wonderful advocate of this work. So this photograph that we're starting with is a photograph that was taken from the road near to where this crop circle occurred. It doesn't look like much, does it? This is actually, the road is about 20 feet above the level of the field. And this is corn about 8 to 9 feet tall. All right. Now, there really is just a slight disturbance that you can tell that maybe something happened there. I was traveling through the area just before this was reported. Anybody in the audience know of Hugh Newman of Megalithomania fame? Anybody? Hugh Newman had come to southern Ohio to visit, and I was taking him around to visit a lot of the ancient mound sites, he and his girlfriend Sheena. And I took him over to see the Hopewell earthwork, which I'll talk about very carefully. And we drove right past this, and I could see the disturbance in the field. But it was actually a little bit farther away from this when we drove past. And I remarked to him that that's the kind of field that we would expect crop circles to appear in because of its location, and I'll talk about why that seems to be important. So we drove right past it and didn't stop and run down in the field to look at it because of exactly what you see here. But this is what it was when you look at it from the air. This is probably one of the largest crop circles that have ever been reported in the United States. It's just eclipsed by one other in terms of the number of circles involved. But for the sheer area, it's pretty sizable, and certainly the largest that's been reported in corn. There are 43 circles and rings associated with this, and it's roughly 450 to 500 feet across, depending on which direction you measure. It's a pretty sizable formation. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this in a lot of depth, and I'm going to show a lot of pictures of what it looked like on the ground, because I think that most people have this general impression that crop circles are really smooth and flat, and this one is a little bit different, and it's very unique, and so we'll talk about that. But before I get to a lot of the details about this, Dolores actually asked me to cover a little bit about crop circles in the United States. So, one of the things when you come to conferences like this and you talk to other researchers is that there's a lot of challenge around nomenclature. People have a difficult time communicating because there's no standard language to talk about things. So we'll just start off with a question. What are crop circles? And we'll try and add a little definition to this. Crop circles are really, at its very most basic level, generally speaking, swirled and flattened areas and patterns found primarily in agricultural fields. But key word is primarily. We're going to see that also that definition can expand a little bit beyond that. Crop circles are also ice circles. There are actually two ice circles in this picture, one here and one a little farther up into the lake. I've had the fortune to investigate a couple of ice circles. They're even more rare than crop circles are. Linda Howe actually investigated this one and put this on Earth Files probably 10 years ago. This one was in Missouri in trees. This is looking down an avenue of a T-junction. This one is in cattails. This is probably one of the most difficult crop circles I've ever had the challenge of trying to get into because of the swampy nature of the area and how isolated it was and how thick the cattails were. But this one actually had two swirled centers to it. This was outside of St. Louis on the Illinois side. I actually was there to go visit a different crop circle, which turned out to be man-made. But on my photo flight, I spotted this, and so we ended up investigating this instead, which was clearly, that one was not man-made. Now, whoops, I went back. So crop circles are also circles in undeveloped areas. This is, you can see 1, 2, and a third circle here. That was in basically scrub grass and in a forested area. This is at a place called the Island Lake State Recreational Area. That's in southern Michigan, outside of Kensington Lake, if people are familiar with that geography there. This was one that I investigated, these dirt rings outside of Albuquerque, not too far from where Linda lives, actually on the opposite side of the mountain where she lives. And then here's another swamp circle. This is right into the kind of the algae on top of a lake or a small pond. So what I try to impress upon people is that there's what I call a spectrum of possibilities with crop circles. Most people are familiar with seeing these because they get all the press. You get these big geometric patterns that people get really excited about. But you can also have just arrangements of circles and rings, single circles, in what we call non-geometric or randomly down formations, in which all of these have the same kinds of effects to the plants, the same kinds of changes to the electromagnetic spectrum that we can measure. They can have increased radiation associated with them. So we see all the same effects in here that we see over here. And I'll just point out this one. This one is from Wisconsin. Many people are familiar with crop circles. You've seen many what they call thought bubble designs where you have a circle and they get kind of descending smaller and smaller. This is what we call like an almost thought bubble. But something happened in the formation part of it that interfered with that geometry. And it's kind of, I like to use the example that's it's a little bit like listening to a radio that's slightly out of tune. Okay? Just slightly out of tune, you kind of get the station, but something interferes with it and that pattern doesn't really show up. But we do see, even in these what we call randomly down formations, we do see elements of geometry in many circumstances, embedded within what appears to be just a random area that's flat. A few years ago, I put together a map of all of the reports of crop circles in the United States. And then I started mapping the ones in Canada, and I got through the province of Ontario, and I got kind of derailed and never quite finished the rest of Canada on my map. But you can see where all these yellow dots are where we have had reports of crop circles in the United States. And there have been about 700 reports in the United States dating all the way back into the early 1800s. And if people are interested in going back and reading those historical reports, you can go out to our website, iccra.org, and you can go to the USA Formations link, and it'll take you to the site. You can look at it by state, or you can look at it by year, and you can, go there and read that. What I will say is that because we're an all-volunteer organization, we're still, putting up reports as we, have time to do it. We're obviously busy with a lot of other things. So I think the reports are current up to about 2005, but we still have, a few more years yet to go to fill that out. And I had planned on putting maps state by state, but I don't think any of those maps are put up except for Ohio. But if you go out there, you can look at all of that information, and it's all free. One of the goals of the ICCRA when we were formed was to pool all of the researchers that are interested in crop circles, to pool all that information together, basic objective information about crop circles that everyone has collected, and to make that available and accessible to everyone as freely as possible. So we don't charge anything for access to the website, and we don't sell anything. So you're free to, go and access it at your leisure without, being bombarded by advertisements or anything like that. I do want to call out Keith Artinger here in the second row. He investigated a number of crop circles on the West Coast, Portland and north, in Oregon and Washington in the 1990s, and he gave us all of his information. So we're working through putting all of that up online, so we'll have more extensive information. What I would suggest is if anyone in the audience has historical reports of information about crop circles here in the United States, go check it out on our website, and if the details there are not correct, or if there is information that you have that you want to contribute, please send it in, because we try to make it a public resource for everyone. And the more information and collectively that we work together, then the better that resource database is. So that's the public service announcement there. What I would say here is, I live in southern Ohio, in the Cincinnati area, and this is about the radius that I will drive to investigate a crop circle personally. I haven't ventured too far out of that ring, but that pretty much covers the area that I, will work in. So that leaves a huge gap in the rest of the United States, but that's filled in with researchers across the U.S. So we have a really good network of researchers across all of the states, pretty much throughout the United States. There have been reports of crop circles in 49 of the 50 states. Anyone want to take a guess at the one state that's never reported any? Collective murmur. Rhode Island. Okay. Rhode Island's the only one. Just for scale purposes, there's England and actually the whole of the British Isles at the same scale. So most of the crop circles in England are primarily found in about 3 counties. We're covering a much, much more vast area than that. And so the reporting of crop circles is a little more challenging here in the United States than it is in England. So there aren't the kinds of concentrations of reports that you would get, for instance, over in Wiltshire County, England. But, we do pretty well over here. We get plenty to work with. Just to look at some historical cases, these would be available in our online database. We have 10 reports from 1823 to 1949. We have 13 reports in the 50s, 44 reports from the 60s, 72 reports from the 70s, a little bit of a fall-off in the 80s, only 38 reports from the 1980s. But here are 3 early photographs. This one was a circle from Delroy, Ohio, 1965. The very first ICCRA crop circle conference that we ever had back in 2004, one of the people who actually investigated this at the time came to our conference and handed me a deck, like a stack of color slides that he had taken of that circle at the time. It was just an amazing treasure of that historical resource of a crop circle. This one here from 1974, Meeker County, Minnesota. This one had more circles than the Chillicothe one. This is the only one that had more circles. And this was in a farm field you could see December. It was found in December. So we actually do have reports of crop circles from every month during the year. Our growing season is, because we're a pretty big country, it's quite a bit different than in England, a much narrower, short, growing season. This one here is one of the earliest color photographs that I've come across of a crop circle that has some geometry associated with it. There's actually a straight line pathway that came off of this crop circle. This pathway here was made by people running out to go look at it. But that was near Malibu in California. Now, the thing about this is, how many people are familiar with the Doug and Dave incident? Okay, the famous octogenarians or whatever that over in England that claimed that they had hoaxed all the crop circles, and that's what was responsible, for the whole phenomenon, right? Well, we have 125 USA crop circle reports that predate the earliest date that they claim to have ever made any crop circles. Okay, and that's notwithstanding all the rest of them that they, of course, never claimed that they came to the United States at all. But if you just go by the very first earliest date that they say that they started making circles, we have 125 reports before that time. So that is a shattered myth as far as I'm concerned. If you ever hear anyone repeat that mythology, you just shoot them down and just direct them out here and say, you're wrong. You're just wrong. So one of the things that we try to do in the ICCRA is when we investigate crop circles, we do it very scientifically. We have a whole series of scientific tests that we run to try and discern the difference between ones that are man-made and ones that are not. And there are ones that people are making. So it's very important for us to try and have that information available to discern the difference before you start going and trying interpreting what that symbol is. Because if you don't have that information, you're just wasting a lot of time, right? It could be man-made, it could not be man-made. So some of the scientific tests that we do what we call an LNEAT. That's sort of kind of an acronym jargon that our group put together that stands for Levengood Node Elongation Analysis Test. And all that really is that W.C. Levengood, a biophysicist, about 1989 or so, began looking at crop circle formations and the plants, to, I guess, examine if there were any changes that he could find as compared to plants that were located in the rest of the field. So he would take what's known as a control, and he would compare that against plants that were down inside crop circles. And actually, he had people that would send him those samples from England primarily, although he was getting some from the United States and Canada and a couple of other countries in Europe. And he discovered through that analysis that the plants, particularly in grass-type plants, so you're talking about wheat, barley, corn, field grass, anything that have growth nodes on the stems, they're kind of like the knuckles on your finger, that they would get elongated or stretched out as a result of whatever energy makes crop circles. And that, I'll say, that energy that makes crop circles is unknown. No one has any good, solid evidence that can explain what that energy is at this point. But that you can see the effects of it on the plants themselves. And so you measure them basically with a ruler, or we use digital calipers, and you measure the growth node. You do that for hundreds of plants, both inside and outside the crop circle, and you do a statistical comparison, and you can get a difference. If you see a difference in them, then that is a unhoaxable effect, or people, with a board and a garden roller stomping down plants can't produce that node elongation. So that was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and that is basically the hallmark standard of looking at a crop circle to define whether or not it's man-made or it's not. Now, it doesn't work for all crops. For instance, soybeans do not have growth nodes. So you can't use that test on soybeans, so we use some other tests. But there are plant and soil tests that we will run. We will measure for changes in the electric field and magnetic field. We will look at the levels of radiation in the area. We will take magnetometer readings. We'll do all kinds of ground measurements. And that is the basic objective information that we use to make that discernment. Now, once we get that and collect that information, we make a determination. Either the crop circle is authentic, it's not mechanically made by people, or it's inconclusive, we didn't collect enough evidence to discern the difference, or we determine that it's man-made, it was mechanically flattened down. Now, if it's man-made, it could be a commercial commission, it could be some researcher experiment, or it could be, the evil, deceptive hoax. Now, if it's authentic, that we go from what we call level 1 analysis to a level 2 analysis. Now we can start to get into the fun stuff of looking at the geometry, looking at the symbol. We can do things like diatonic ratio analysis, all kinds of higher order information that you can't really do unless you do this level 1 analysis first and make that discernment. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. So if you see reports on the internet where none of this information has been collected and no one made that discernment, you're just looking at a lot of pictures, and there's not a lot of information there. So I encourage people to try and follow that. Now, 2 years ago when I was here, I reported on a sort of breakthrough discovery that I had made in looking at crop circle formations. I'm just going to briefly talk about this. I started that mapping project, which I showed you a map of, and I moved from that mapping program, which was Microsoft MapPoint, to Google Earth Pro as Google Earth began to be more sophisticated. And when you could see the satellite photography of the landscape that you were looking at, and you could import your own photos and photogrammatically correct them and put them into the landscape in the correct orientation. And actually, in some circumstances, the satellite photography has captured the location of where those crop circles are located. I've actually discovered a couple of crop circles that have never been reported looking at Google Earth. I've also been able to narrow down the time of formation based on the published satellite photography dates in Google Earth, where somebody had, discovered a crop circle and we mark that date as the earliest known date. But then we go to Google Earth and we see that the satellite took a picture of that crop circle maybe 3 or 4 days before someone discovered it. So now we narrowed down the time of formation. You get better and better information as that goes on. So I undertook a big project to try and map out as many of the crop circles as I possibly could based on the information that we had. GPS readings, good aerial photography where we could photogrammatically correct for it. And I was, studying the locations of them, and in one particular formation, there was an alignment of circles that kind of bothered me, and so I drew some lines on the map, and it turned out that the alignment of those circles led to another crop circle. And so I started looking at my map of all the different crop circles, and I found that every single crop circle that we had in our database that we had good mapping data for, about 160 reports, that any of those formations that had a straight line component to its design, and this one has quite a number of them, every one of those straight lines pointed to the center of another crop circle formation in the United States, or it actually pointed right into another line. They like interlock, or they self-referenced each other. So basically you draw your lines there, and you can see there's quite a number here, and they all point out to the centers of other crop circle formations. Now, that's a really mind-blowing, kind of thing to wrap your head around. It brings up a couple of questions in my mind as to either all the crop circles were planned out in advance and they're slowly showing up, or we're looking at some kind of hidden underlying geometry to our world that is being revealed by the energetic trace of the crop circle. So some energy comes down and hits the ground or hits the plants and leaves this geometry behind, and it's only that the only time we get to see that geometry is when these events occur. That geometry is ever present in the landscape. That's another possibility. So all it did was it raised more questions to me as to what is the true nature of crop circles, but this is, pretty intriguing stuff. So for those that didn't see me 2 years ago, I'm sure you can buy it on DVD. I don't get anything for it, but you guys can, see that information all about this. It was about a 2-hour talk. Now, one of the things that we did over time, we kind of collected this database of information, and we found that crop circles don't happen anywhere or everywhere. They happen in certain places in the landscape that have contextual features around them that are similar to one another. 95% of the crop circles that we've looked at in the Midwest have 3 components that we see with that high correlation number. Now, correlation doesn't equal causation, but there does appear to be this relationship between these elements in the landscape and where crop circles form. And the 3 are, they're appearing near power lines. And in 85% of the cases, the closest power line pole to the crop circle has a transformer box on it. The second one is that they're coming down in close proximity to some body of water, a creek, pond, drainage ditch, right over the top of an aquifer. We see that connection with water. The third is that they appear on the downslope of a hill or at the very bottom of the hill or the lowest part of the field. You don't very often see crop circles at the top of hills. It's almost like never happens. Now, if we survey a site within the first 10 days, then ordinarily, we in the non-man-made formations, we do see changes to the electric field and the magnetic field, and we do end up picking up low-level increases in radiation. Nothing that'll kill you. It's but it's statistically significant when you measure it against the control. Now, there's one fourth criteria, which we will talk about here, that the correlation is a little bit less, but still very high, and that's about 65% of the crop circles are coming down in close proximity to Native American earthworks or archaeological sites. And this crop circle that I talked about at the beginning at Chillicothe, Ohio, was right adjacent to one of these earthworks, so we'll talk about that a little bit. This photograph here that I took of a crop circle actually up in Canada, I was invited by the Canadian group to help them with researching this one. You can see the body of water here, and actually it was right over the top of an aquifer. This over here is actually a slope, and this drainage area is, you can see the indication of the slope. There are power lines that run right along here. There are Native American earthworks in Ontario that are too far from here, but I'm not that familiar with the Ontario earthworks, so I don't know about this particular one. I just helped out briefly on this particular investigation. Let me stop here for a moment. This photograph looks awfully similar to the last one. for those that can't see all the way in the back, I'll try and point this out with some arrows. There's the crop circle formation located in the landscape. Down here, you can see that is the North Fork of Paint Creek. That's the name of the water body there that runs alongside. There are high-tension power lines that cut right across the field. There is a limestone quarry right across from there. And for those that have ever heard of another criteria that we see associated with crop circles quite regularly, is that they appear over the top of limestone or green sand aquifers. And so this is another sort of interesting indication. And then this tree line here, it's kind of hard to see the yellow dots, at least from this angle, but this tree line going out to about here and then cutting across and continuing on this tree line, and then a square in this open green field, that is the Hopewell Mound Group. It's really big. You could fit the distance between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial inside there and with ease. And that was built about 2,000 years ago. And there are two mountains that are visible, remnants in this picture, Mount 23 right here and Mount 25, this big oval area right here. That was the largest single Hopewell culture construction burial mound. They found more when it was excavated back in the late 1890s. It was excavated by the Chicago Field Museum for the Chicago World's Fair. And they basically took what we consider a bulldozer pulled by horses, and they just bulldozed that mound. And they collected all the artifacts and the bodies that were inside there. There were more than 100 people buried in that mound. And if you go to the Chicago Field Museum today, they have about 30 or 40 artifacts from there on display, but there were several thousand that were found. And just to kind of show you a diagram of that site, this is the earliest, no, this is not the earliest, this is the second diagram that was ever done. This one was a survey conducted in 1847 of the site. This area here is now considered Mound 25. This is Mound 23. The crop circle would happen right here in this field. Just to show you a couple more, this is a later one. This is the one that the Chicago Field Museum did in the 1890s. There was another archaeological survey that was done in the 1920s by the Ohio Historical Society, and they produced another one. So it's been excavated a number of times. It is now owned by the National Park Service and is part of the Hopewell Culture National Historic Park, of which there are, I think, now 8 of these gigantic Hopewellian geometric earthworks that have been preserved by the National Park Service, and they're actually up for a World Heritage nomination. So we'll see if they get one. But this is just a couple of the artifacts that have been found there. These are made out of copper. I'm only just going to show 4 of them. But you can see the kind of real fine artistic quality. There's an ankh. There were actually swastikas made out of copper that were found. This is the one that I mentioned to Linda Howe for her Earth Files site. This has 7 cutouts along the edge, and that may or may not have some relationship to what we see in the crop circle, but we'll talk about that here shortly. So this is just another aerial photograph. You can see here, there's the crop circle in this lower field. The upper field is where the earthwork is. It actually stretches from here to the edge, from the edge of this photo all the way to the other edge over here. There's the National Park Service parking lot right there. And so the earthwork is gigantic, and comparatively speaking, the crop circle seems rather small, but still one of the largest crop circles ever reported in the United States. Now, one of my side hobbies is actually archaeology. And I actually have given several lectures about this to archaeological societies and in other contexts. But I was the very first one in the state of Ohio to produce LiDAR survey maps of many of the earthworks. LiDAR is a technology, basically you fly over in a plane and a laser, infrared laser kind of shoots down to the ground and is reflected back up to a sensor in the plane. And you can get incredibly accurate survey maps done by having that single point source reflection back up to it. This map, which I created, is about 700,000 data points. Used to, when you did surveys, you'd get out your tripod and you'd get your thing, and you'd look through there and you'd have somebody in the distance with a pole holding onto it and you'd take a survey point. Well, flying over it now with your laser, you can collect hundreds of thousands of data points very quickly, put that into your mapping program, and you can get accuracy to within about 2 to 3 centimeters. And so I was the first one I actually mapped Serpent Mound first, but then I mapped about 60 other archaeological sites in the state of Ohio, and now other archaeologists in many other states have adopted this methodology, and they're doing archaeological survey work for archaeology sites like this. One of the fun things that you can do is the sensor can determine the reflectivity of what the surface is, and so it can determine whether it's bouncing off of trees or bouncing off a sidewalk. And once that data is collected, you can tell the computer, I don't want to see any of the trees. And you just remove all the trees. And so it reveals a lot of things that have been gone unnoticed. And so I've made a lot of archaeological discoveries of earthworks and portions of earthworks based on this technology. So this is just a survey there. You can see up at the top there is the exterior earthwork wall of the enclosure. You can see there's mound 3. There's a couple of forward here. There we go. There's mound 23. What I'll focus on though is this is the field down here where the crop circle occurred. Now this is in gradient color, so the color is determining telling you what the elevation is. The darker the color, the lower the elevation. So remember what I said about crop circles showing up in the lowest part of the field or on the downslope. Well, the crop circle occurred, and you can see right here, there's this dark color that goes through that low part of the field. That's actually where the old channel of the riverbed went. And the crop circle was centered right on the old channel of the riverbed. And so this is where the riverbed is today. So sometimes this kind of technology helps you to see other things that you might not have seen. There's the channel of the riverbed. Okay. This is the very first picture that I took walking into the crop circle. The farmer and the landowner were the two people ahead of me, and they walked in just before I did. This crop circle was spotted by someone flying over in an airplane. I had to contact the farmer and the landowner. The landowner actually lived out of state. So it took me a while to hunt her down, and they gave us graciously permission, and we really thanked them for it because this is an amazing formation, and they really helped us in our investigation. So one of the things that you'll see is that it looks really messy, doesn't it? I mean, really messy. It's not smoothly flattened down. Now, at first glance, you might say, well, this is just a mess. This is clearly somebody just stomped around, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and they screwed this up. But actually, what you're seeing is that each of these corn stalks, and I mean every single corn stalk that's there, is flattened at a different height. Now, if you're a hoaxer, think about trying to hoax that. You're talking about 43 circles in an area that's at least 450 to 500 feet wide, and you have to flatten down every single stalk by hand, essentially, if you wanted to try and replicate anything close to this. This is almost unprecedented. I can only think of 2 other corn crop circle formations where we've seen anything like this, but we've never seen anything like this to this extent. All right, so we're going to look at several pictures here. This is actually the central circle in the entire crop circle formation. And one of the things that you'll see is that there are a couple of standing stalks at the center here, but that all of the stalks immediately surrounding it are radially pointing in towards the center. Okay? But that's just the upper layer, because this actually had several layers to it, and the flow pattern is different in those different layers. The outer portion, the outer 10 to 12 feet all the way around, was actually flattened radially away from the center of the circle. So you have a lot of things going on in this one crop circle, which is only 37 feet in diameter. So here's what the flow looks like. The lowest sort of area was a 3/4 turn clockwise, and then you had another big half turn this way. There was a little area that was counterclockwise down here. This whole section in the center was flattened towards the center. All of this on the outside was flattened away from the center. Multiple layering in corn. Here's another sort of panoramic shot. I got to say how difficult it is to capture photographs of these circles on the ground when the corn is taller than you surrounding it. When I first went out there with the landowner and the farmer, my wife and I, Delcy, went out there. It took me, I'm not kidding, it took me just over 2 hours just to walk from circle to circle to see them all. That's not, doing any investigating, but just walking from one circle to the next, to the next, to the next, taking photographs as I went along, took me a little over 2 hours. Now, for those that remember the original image, the original aerial of it, there seems to be circles kind of snaking off in all these directions. So it's a bit maze-like when you get in there, and most of the researchers that came, we actually assembled a group of about 25 researchers to come and investigate this in one day. Most of them got quite disoriented, even though I provided an aerial photograph as a map, and we numbered all the circles so that they could identify which ones that they were in, that people got quite disoriented trying to navigate their way through this formation. There's my wife, Delcy. This is in one of the low areas, and what you'll see is that in between 2 circles here, there is a line of standing stalks, single row of standing stalks, still left standing in between that divided the circles. This circle does not have a standing stalk in the center. I'll just comment on that briefly. 85% of the circles in this formation had at least one standing stalk at the center, but the remaining ones did not, because the center of the swirl was in the planting gap between the rows of the corn. So there was no stalk there to leave standing, but in all the rest of the circles, it was on the row. So for what that's worth, that's kind of why that is the way it is. Here's kind of a close-up of one of the smaller circles, and here's a row of standing corn in between. So this corn is swirled down. It's not, flat and straight. It's really difficult to do that in corn, try and get that to bend. Here's another small circle that has a single stalk at the center. This is probably an 8-foot diameter circle. They ranged anywhere from, I want to say the largest ones were 80 feet. Those are the rings, all the way down to about 3 feet in diameter. So there's quite a range of the sizes of circles. I want to show some of the kinds of different effects that we saw in the formation. This is here's a circle swirl down, and you'll see that this section along this one planting row, starting from here, this is flattened about 2.5 feet tall. And the next stalk a little bit taller, and the next one a little bit taller, a little bit taller, a little bit taller, a little bit taller. And so it's a bit like a stair-stepping effect going across that row. But we saw this in a couple of different circumstances. Here is a close-up of one particular stalk. This is where it is coming out of the ground here, comes up, is bent above the growth node, comes over here, is bent again above the growth node, comes back down, is bent down here, and is in the flow of the rest of it. So double sort of 90-degree bend. Did not break these stalks in most circumstances. We'll show a couple of additional panoramas of some of the other circles. There's my wife Delcy again for scale. You can see again how many sort of standing stalks or flattened at different heights that these stalks were. Here's another one. You can actually see the slope that this is on here. There's a kind of a significant slope here. Show some more. Here's one of the rings. You can see there's probably about a 30-foot diameter standing area here. Again, this is about 8 to 9 feet tall, and the rest of this is swirled down. Now, it's not swirled down in just one direction. The innermost portion of this is swirled down clockwise, about 2 to 3 feet wide. Then the next section adjacent that's flattened is swirled counterclockwise, going in the opposite direction. And they alternate flow up to 5 times in the rings. So there are a number of these rings, and they alternate flow back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And there was really nothing to be found inside the centers of these. We actually had an 8-foot ladder and a 10-foot ladder, and to actually measure these out, we had to use both ladders to measure these because you couldn't, stick the measuring tape in between the rows of corn to, measure this stuff out. It was pretty challenging to navigate through. Here is one photograph that was taken at the top of that 10-foot ladder. I got at the top, and you can see a number of the researchers kind of scattered throughout the formation. So you can see, even at 10 feet above, immediately above the top of the crop circle, you can't really make out what that formation looks like. It's really challenging. There it is. Okay. So here's the rings that I was just talking about. There's that central circle. And you'll notice that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 what we call arms. And each of these arms is like a little thought bubble formation unto itself. But they're all sort of connected one to another. But that the circles themselves, they sort of descend in size, but they don't follow the same curvature. They actually, some of them change direction in their curvature as they go along. That's kind of an interesting sort of idea. I'll get back to that. One of the things that happened to us is that we had some electromagnetic interference with some of our equipment in the formation. How many people in here own an iPhone? Not as many as I thought. Wow. Android must be winning over. Well, for those that have an iPhone and want to do investigative work, buy this application called Theodolite Pro. It's about as good as I could possibly recommend. It collects elevation data, horizon data, latitude and longitude, your position and altitude. It tells you, what your angles are here. It gives you your coordinates and which way you're pointing, north, south, east, west, that kind of thing. And it captures all that information on the photograph that you take. So whatever direction you're pointing or whatever you're trying to measure, it captures all that information. The problem in some crop circles is that you get this. Compass interference. Move away from any interference to recalibrate. It's tough to do when you're in the crop circle, and that's what you're trying to capture. But I'm not the only one that got this. This actually happened to my camera, but it happened to about 8 of us. Here's another picture looking right at the iPhone. Someone's using a different application, a different digital compass, and you can see that happened there. We got low-level interference. It didn't interfere with all of our equipment, but it did interfere with digital compasses on cell phones, both on the iPhone and on Androids. Some people had different ones, different researchers had different ones. So whatever that interference was, it was certainly affecting that digital compass. I mentioned the LNEAT protocol, the Levengood node elongation analysis test. Dr. Chuck Lietzau, biologist in the ICCRA, is down here lying on the ground with his digital calipers, and he's got some magnifiers on, and he's actually measuring the nodes, the growth nodes, in the crop circle right on site. We try not to collect a lot of plant samples for this purpose. We can collect that data right on site. We don't have to, have someone collect it all and send it to somebody else for analysis. We just do it right on site. We collect that, write down all those measurements, and then we do the analysis afterwards. So here he is in, I think, the central circle measuring some of those nodes. We had two assistants that helped him, which we were really thankful for. We had to divide and conquer. We had about 25 researchers, and each of them was assigned a different thing. And it took us the entire day. We started at 8 a.m. and we went to 9 p.m. at night. And we managed to gather all of the testing in one day because the very next day the farmer harvested the field. So we had to get it done ASAP. So what I'll say about the node analysis here, we did 132 formation samples. We did 87 control samples. All of that was measured. All of those growth nodes were measured, and the growth nodes of the formation plants were significantly larger, and that's an unhoaxable effect. So it's not mechanically made by people. What I'll say about this is that every single formation node length average was larger than the control formation average. So there's no kind of overlap between that, and that in and of itself is highly significant. So we have kind of double information on that. I mentioned that that test was named after W.C. Levengood. I've been working with W.C. Levengood since 1996. That's about 15 years. And I am sorry to say that this is the last formation I believe that he will have done any work on. He is entered into the hospital. He's in hospice. So we got samples from this, and he was gracious enough to work on germination samples of this. He did not manage to get all the samples germinated before he went into the hospital, but he was able to get a control, and he did samples from Circle 21. And that in and of itself is enough to give us a formation sample and a control sample. And so what you see here is this graph right here. This is the formation analysis information. This is the control information. The control samples, he would germinate them for 4 days. So you would germinate them for 4 days and it would start to grow. And this was a control sample at 150 feet outside the formation. The average growth at 4 days was 5.42 millimeters. In the Circle 21, the average was 7.35. So you got accelerated growth rate even at 4 days from germination from this formation. This information up here is a little more statistically rigorous. We're looking at ranges. This is the upper range of measurements to the lower range of measurements for both formations, and the mean versus the zero on the control. We had a 36% more growth rate than the control did. So that's what this information means. And the difference between those two, you do this sort of statistical analysis. I don't want to get into all the details, but this number here, 0.0000288817. The more zeros you have, the more statistically significant it is. And having that many zeros means it's actually what they call extraordinarily significant, the difference between the two. So that kind of, and the picture up here, this is the control ear here, and you can see some of the odd changes that happened to the corn from the formation. There was a lot of kind of weird looking ears of corn that we ended up looking at. Now, let me see if I can go back a couple so you can look at that overhead picture again. Should have stuck one in here in between while I'm trying to find this. There are very few people that live anywhere close to this earthwork. I think I gotta go back farther than I thought. Yeah, here you go. There are people that live way out here, but you can see there's a lot of forested area between there and where that crop circle is. This is actually the closest house. And the gentleman that lives there now, his name is Rick Ray. About the time that the crop circle was reported to have been found, he came to and told us about an unusual experience that he had in that time frame. I'll skip down to that. Sorry about that. Skip back down to that slide. Rick Ray was woken up at about 3:30 in the morning on Sunday, September 15th. This crop circle was reported a few days later by somebody flying over in a plane. It was that Monday that I took Hugh Newman on a tour through that area. So, actually, it was later that day. Actually, he heard this incident in the early morning hours on Sunday. Hugh and I went through there on Sunday afternoon. Now, what he heard was, he said he was awoken about 3:30 in the morning to this really loud sound that he could hear in his whole house. He got up out of bed. He went out into his backyard. The sound was still going. He described the sound, and these are his words, he described the sound as weird. He said it's really weird. It's nothing like he'd ever heard of before. He couldn't imitate it. Best that he could describe it was a whistling sound. And he said it was almost mechanical sounding, but it was a whistling sound. The sound lasted long enough that he could identify, after going out in his backyard, that it was to the south-southeast. And that's exactly the direction of where the crop circle was located. He did not have a direct view of where the crop circle was located because there's kind of a grove of trees in between there. So he didn't, see the crop circle form or anything like that. But he described the sound as coming down from above, and the sound came down quickly, and it softened in intensity when it came down towards the ground and faded away. And the whole event lasted, just 2 to 3 minutes. Now, I spent some time on the web thinking about this kind of sound, whistling sound. For those that don't know me or haven't read the booklet, I do have a background in science. I got a master's in general science. I actually did a lot of severe and unusual weather work with the National Weather Service and others. And so I am somewhat familiar with a lot of the kinds of unusual weather events that can take place. And I remembered, actually, from a kind of a rare crop circle book that was published around 1990 or so. There was an article in this book that was written by Donald Cyr, C-Y-R. Anybody remember him? He's an author from way back. Wrote on all kinds of paranormal phenomena, but he wrote this 5-page article about crop circles. He worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for a while. He was an engineer. He had a background in kind of the same sorts of things, technology and astronomy and weather and things like that. And he wondered if at least some crop circles were made by a phenomenon called whistlers. Anybody in here ever heard of whistlers? I think out of 100 people, I think I get less than 1 out of 100 people who even know what that is. Well, whistlers are low-frequency electromagnetic waves that are generated from thunderstorms. The lightning occurs, and you get this electromagnetic wave that goes up instead of down. And in some circumstances, those electromagnetic waves get trapped in the ionosphere and they follow along magnetic field lines. The Earth has a magnetic field. You guys have seen that sort of bar magnet of the Earth. This is kind of a diagram of, one of those magnetic lines of force. And those whistlers get trapped, that sound frequency, that electromagnetic frequency, and they bounce back and forth in those magnetic field lines. But occasionally, they come down to the surface of the ground. And some of them have been recorded audibly. So I sent Rick Ray a whole selection of these, and the best that I can narrow down is that it sounds pretty much, if I move this over here, kind of sounds like this. That's the play. This audio recording was made by Stephen McGreevy up in Grass River Provincial Park in Manitoba, Canada. And McGreevy, you can go to his website, or you can go to www.archive.org, where he has probably 100 of these recordings of whistlers and other kind of audio phenomenon like this. And it's all free to the public. It's all open source information, so you can download it at your leisure. He's had several CDs that he's put out of these audio recordings. Well, whistlers have this frequency that appears in the audio part of the spectrum, and it's at about 1 kilohertz to 30 kilohertz, and they kind of sometimes come down to the ground. And I'm wondering if Rick Ray actually heard this in association with the crop circle formation. They are produced by lightning strikes, and that they, once they kind of get trapped in that magnetic field, they're going through the ionosphere and they're kind of dispersing the plasma that is up there in the ionosphere. So you get kind of a weird descending tone as they come down close to the ground. So there are different types, and I just played one of them, but that's what whistlers are. So I'm going to stop here for a second and say that all of that sort of scientific information, we determined that the crop circle was not man-made. So that allows us to move on to that sort of level 2 analysis. We're actually still in the process of doing level 2 analysis. This is a complicated formation, and sometimes it takes us a while to try and understand it and get through it. But I've corrected the orientation of this photo, so north is at the top. You see west and east. There are 36 individual circles and 7 rings for a total of 43. What we do is we kind of create a diagram based on that formation. Once we correct for that, we number all the circles, and that's sort of the map that we used when we went through the formation, so that we could identify where we were collecting all our data from. So here's what that diagram sort of looks like, and you can see that these circles sort of snake back and forth. Some of them fall on an arc, some of them have a more severe arc than others, some of them, start off this way and then turn back. So they don't all go in the same direction. But when I went and looked at this, there was something about it that really kind of caught my attention. This is actually the flow diagram that I made. You can see that the dark colors here, these are clockwise, the light colors are counterclockwise. In the rings, you can see that there are lots of arrows because it goes back and forth. And if you were to try and animate this, think about that going on, forming all at the same time. That's kind of what you see, is, this is how stuff gets flattened almost simultaneously. If we were to take sort of the classic diagrams that we make for crop circles, you black out the areas that are flat, and that's what it looks like. And it was at this point that I said, you know what? There's something about this that I recognize. This looks very fractal in nature to me. People know what fractals are? A lot of people in here? They're a mathematical algorithm that describes the boundary conditions between order and chaos at the subatomic level. So this table is solid to us, but when you get down to the subatomic level and you get to the boundary conditions, that becomes very fractal in nature. That's what it describes, those mathematical algorithms. So to me, this looked like a lot of fractals that I had seen. But you can see that there's some geometry to it. There are 7 sides to it. It's a sort of 7-sided figure. A lot of people, when they looked at this originally, they said, "Why, that's really a mess. That, it's not symmetrical. It's asymmetrical." Well, it's actually symmetrical, but in a 7-sided way. Each of these arms has the exact same number of circles going out away from it, but it's 7-sided in nature. You can look at it in a whole bunch of different, impose different kinds of geometry on it. So you can see, that it extends out through the whole formation. Now, it took me a long while, to figure out what this figure was. I went through probably over 1,000 different fractals. I thought I had nailed it a couple of times. I had mentioned to Linda on one of our radio interviews that I thought it might be this or it might be that, but this is actually what it is. I finally figured out what this is. Has anybody seen this figure before? Before Linda posted it on Earth Files? I actually, came across this on a website. But this is a kind of a fractal figure, but it's in 3 dimensions. And when you superimpose the crop circle into that 3-dimensional model, it fits, and it follows the line of curvatures based on these sort of lines of the diagrams. This is what is known as a heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation. I would imagine that there are now, before you guys have all heard it, there were probably 100 people in the world that ever heard that ever even knew what that was. Okay? And it's now crop circle design in a farm field in southern Ohio. Now, this design actually has some interesting significance to it, and I don't imagine you can read any of that text, but this diagram is based on the inverse of phi. So for those that know that mathematical ratio of phi, it's based on the inverse of phi. And these lines that are here, anybody in here familiar with, in physics, string theory? Okay. Basically, string theory in physics is every particle in the universe is connected to another particle by kind of an energetic string. That's what they get the name from. That's the simplest point. This is saying, like, if you were to imagine that this is one of those particles, there would be lines radiating out that would connect to other particles around it in the universe. But this is a specific kind of fractal. This is a 7-sided figure, right? If we put that diagram back up here, this central circle then connects out to each one of these circles in a very specific manner. 7 circles can fit around that central circle. You could create this diagram and make 8 circles around it, or you could make bigger circles that touch, right? You could have, a whole different number of circles that could make it around that central circle. But this one is 7. Well, it turns out that there's a physicist, an Egyptian physicist by the name of M.S. El-Nachi, who about 10 years ago was working on string theory. And he's looking at different levels of dimensions, and he basically settled on the fact that our underlying nature of reality is a hyperbolic planar tessellation. But not just any hyperbolic planar tessellation, it's a heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation. It is the seven-sided figure. Okay. Now, for those that don't really understand that term, hepta, it means seven. So a heptagonal is a seven-sided figure. Hyperbolic and the planar refers to the projection here that you're seeing in that sort of three dimensions. But if you were to observe this, basically going off out to the edges is like going out to infinity. So if you were to fly over from the center and try to fly out to the edge, it would just extend out into infinity. And so this just is a projection of that looking like infinity. The tessellation refers to the repeating pattern. So this repeating pattern over and over of seven sides that surround every circle. So it's a very, very unusual diagram, a very challenging sort of geometry to wrap your head around. I don't quite know, what to make of it, other than almost no one in the world has ever heard of one, and it took me a while to figure it out that the two were related. It really stretched my mind for better or worse, I guess. But that's kind of what it is. This is what it looks like if you were to look at it face on, just directly overhead. I put the other one up to give it to you on somewhat of an angle so you can see the three-dimensional nature of it. So I think we'll stop there, and I wanted to leave time for questions. I know that the last time around, people had about 15 or 20 minutes worth of questions, so I'll stop here, and thanks for your attention. I know that I'm the one keeping you from the bar, right? So.
One. Okay, there we go. Question.
I figured I would end early. I know people have. Yeah.
There we go. You ready, sir? Let me just take the question.
Thank you for the great presentation tonight. Has anybody seen these being made?
Have there been eyewitnesses to crop circles forming?
Yes.
Yes. There have been about 50 people around the world that are documented eyewitnesses to crop circles actually forming right in front of them. The last eyewitness case that has been reported, I actually investigated back in 2003, and that was in Wisconsin. And the gentleman saw basically 3 crop circles form and actually had some geometry associated with it. It took about 12 seconds.
So he didn't see anything, but he saw them made, basically. So
he described the incident as he woke up about 7 o'clock in the morning, and he's a retired truck driver. He was kind of a weather aficionado, and so he got up, turned on the Weather Channel, saw that a storm front was coming, and so he went out to his workshop, which sat on the top of a hill. And he had a big picture window on the end of the workshop. And he made himself some coffee and sat there to watch the weather front arrive. And when the weather front arrived, he noticed that the trees right outside the window, the bark started coming off the tree right outside the window, and then the trees across the street were swaying pretty violently. And it directed his gaze to a farm field across the street that was a hillside that faced him. And the 3 crop circles, one went down. They went down in succession. So 1, 2, and then the third one on the opposite side. And it took 12 seconds for all 3 to go down. He saw no unusual lights. He heard no unusual sounds. The only thing it was associated with that weather front. And I would say that About the 50 eyewitnesses that have seen crop circles form, generally most of them report crop circles associated with the passage of a weather front.
So it seems like you're getting close to the reason of these with the ionosphere type. Do you think that's probably what's causing these?
It's a possibility. What I would say is that I think that over time, I have had different sort of hypotheses as to what makes crop circles form. But as I continue to gather more evidence, I find evidence to disprove some of them, or that they don't quite explain all of the details that we see in certain formations. So it's possible that there may be more than one source cause to what are making crop circles. What I mean by that is, some people, you look at the headlines in the paper and they say it's aliens or it's a hoax. And what I'm saying is that there may be more possibilities or more alternatives than that. And that it's not an either-or proposition. It may be both, it may be more explanations than that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I was going to make a joke about Monsanto corn, but I'm going to go right to my question. In England, is there a different pattern with the electronics being nearby the crop circle as opposed to the United States?
I'm not sure what you mean by that question.
Does the nearness to an electrical source affect the crop circle with the same frequency in England as it does here? Because I would think that in England there'd be less electronics in the areas.
Oh, you mean like the proximity to power lines?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know because I don't really spend my time studying the crop circles in England.
Okay.
And that's just a straightforward, honest answer. What I would say, just as a follow-up to that, is they have a horrific hoaxing problem in England. Most of the researchers in England will tell you that the level of hoaxing is probably above 90%. So
Wow.
they would tell you that to your face. I know Freddie Silva wrote a great book about crop circles, and he doesn't even bother going back there anymore. So it's a waste of his time. So I tend not to go there. I've been there. My wife and I went there on our honeymoon. We looked at 7 crop circle formations in 2 weeks. Some of them reported that morning. We were some of the first people in it, like within the first 2 or 3 people in the formation. Every one that I saw was man-made. I did not see one that was not. So
Thank you.
They have a bad hoaxing problem.
Yeah, I was curious, have there ever been like dead insects or organisms or animals found within the crop circles?
Yes, there have. It's actually kind of like the dirty secret of crop circles that a lot of researchers don't want to talk about. But if you go into our ICCRA database, you'll find probably 20 to 25 reports of crop circles in association with dead animals, a couple associated with injuries to people that happened back in the 1950s. Both of the cases were in Florida that affected people. Some dogs, some cattle, some deer. There have been instances of insects. There was a notable case up in Canada back in, I think it was 89 or 90, of a porcupine being caught in a crop circle, kind of smashed flat and dragged around. There was an incident in the database of a formation in the United States back in the 70s in which a deer was caught halfway in the formation. Basically, the head was in the formation, the body was outside, but was like severed right, from the head from the body. I would not want to be in one when one occurs, although after the fact doesn't seem to be, any problems once a crop circle occurs. I have had one crop circle formation reported to me, and this was in the state of Kentucky. I would say about 2004 or 5, I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, in which there was a crop circle formation, multiple circles that were found. And a group of people went out to visit it. And there was a woman that reportedly had skin cancer that was amongst the group. She was interested in going out there, to see if somehow it could heal her or whatever. But while those people were in the formation, another circle began to appear adjacent to the rest of the formation, and they said that they noticed that there were it was like an electrical discharge glow around their hands and arms, and it began sort of light and began to intensify until showers of sparks started coming out of their hands, and then the circle formed, and it was over. The event was over. But the woman who had skin cancer, I guess it like halted it, and it kind of like fell off her body. So she was that was a sort of secondhand report that I got. None of those people would ever go on the record. I got just basically the general location of it. It would not let people go out and investigate it, but that was what was reported to me. So there's all kinds of a range of effects that can happen. From really, really bad things to certain organisms, and then after the fact, sometimes some good things can come out of it. A lot of people report healing effects inside them. A lot of people report a wide range of physical effects. I've had a wide range of physical effects happen to me inside crop circles, both good and bad. And I would say that every crop circle seems to be somewhat unique in that they have their own sort of energetic pattern after the fact. So.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I noticed when you had your map, excuse me, of the locations of sightings up on your, that it appeared to me that a lot of them, or the majority of them, were along interstate highways, especially along the West Coast. Have you seen that?
From that map scale, it probably would appear so. I would say that in our database, maybe 5 reports along interstate highways. Not very many at all. Most of them are in places that no one's ever heard of, in such a rural area that you would be hard-pressed to find some of them on a map. So, yeah, from that map scale, it can appear that way, but I would say it's not really the case.
Yes, this will sound totally unrelated, and it maybe is, but just want to address, in case speakers will be here tomorrow, hear this question, is anything about the sinkhole phenomenon that seems to be happening across the nation, where Mother Earth seems to be angry and swallowing his children?
That's kind of out of my realm, although what I would say is that in a lot of those areas where sinkholes occur, that ground is limestone, right? And so, you get water that goes through there and erodes that limestone and creates a sinkhole.
Yes.
A lot of the places where crop circles occur are in places that have limestone underneath the ground.
Yes.
So maybe there's a relationship there, but I wouldn't want to speculate on it.
No, I'm just curious. Thank you.
Sure.
How you doing? John Fraser from Tulsa. Do you know, or have you researched the kind of like the message or answer back that was near that radio telescope that had the picture of the person? Do you know if that's real or not?
Only from secondhand. I'm friends with a lot of researchers in England, and I know several of the researchers that were the first ones on the scene to investigate that crop circle, and they said that it was man-made. All indications were they saw all kinds of mechanical damage there. So I would suggest that probably is man-made. Okay,
and the second question would be, have you ever done like 3D images or extrapolated it out? Like I think I saw in a UFO Congress, someone was talking about like UFO propulsion systems, and they created what looked like an energy source, or the mechanical makings of an energy source for something else.
A lot of people, I've seen a lot of speculation in that area over time. We tend not to go in that direction just because there are so many other avenues to investigate. If you are interested in that kind of thing, there was a good book written, I think in '94, by a gentleman by the name of Doug Ruby. It was called The Gift, and he made a whole series of 3-dimensional models of crop circles that he then put on a turntable and spun them at high speed to get a 3-dimensional look to them, reflected light off them. And I thought that was really interesting, but no one in our organization has really taken it upon themselves to try and replicate that.
Okay.
That's probably, I mean, if you're interested,
Okay.
you know,
Thank you.
we can help provide you with that information.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, two things. You showed a slide of a crop circle and then it pointed to other ones that happened in the nation. Can you show that slide again? And what kind of time period did that happen? Was that all within a short amount of time, or?
That's a really good question. I'll go back to that slide. I know that came from that other presentation, but I can explain that a little more fully. Because there's actually something really interesting about that. Okay, this is the map that was created from the pathways that led from the previous crop circle that I showed, this one right here. This was a crop circle that happened in Madisonville, Tennessee, in a wheat field. And when you extended out those straight lines out in the distance, including the ones from the triangle in the center, they extended out in the landscape and they hit a whole series of crop circles in the landscape. But one of the things you'll notice is that there are different dates on all those crop circles, right? One of the things that we found was that I was, of course, using a whole historical database of information when I was making my mapping, database. So what I found was that in some circumstances, let's say I mapped out a crop circle in 1996, and it had straight line components to it, the pathway might point to a crop circle that happened in 1992, right? But in a number of cases, it pointed to crop circles that had not yet happened. Say, it pointed to a crop circle that was going to happen in 2003. So one of the things and one of the reasons why we haven't published the database for this, is that we're trying to use this information as a diagnostic tool to help us predict the location of where crop circles might form in the future. Because we have some indication, based on this evidence, we can extend lines out into the landscape, and we might be able to see if future crop circles come down in those places. So your question is a good observational one, and one that is important to our understanding of this piece of the phenomenon. It's a really tricky one, but we did not want to let this information get out to any great extent in terms of the specificity of the data, because all it will take is, one hoaxer out there, and then you've got a contaminated database. One of the things I will say is that I did map out as many of the man-made crop circle formations as well, and none of the man-made formations that had any straight line components to them pointed to anything else. So we do see a discernment between the ones that we had considered to be man-made and the ones that were not man-made. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes. Yeah, like I said, about 160 formations that will crisscross and point to each other. This one just happened to have the most number that it pointed to. Some will point to 1, some will point to 3 or 4. It just depends on how many straight line components are part of the original design. Yes?
I just wanted to ask you to repeat something you said so quickly there at the end that I didn't quite catch it.
Sure.
When you were speaking with regard to the heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation and the string theory.
Yeah.
You said the fellow said it was our underlying something, and I didn't catch.
So if you think about it, it's like the underlying nature of our own reality.
Okay.
All subatomic particles are connected to one another, and it appears that they're connected with this kind of heptagonal hyperbolic planar tessellation.
Okay, thank you.